In the vibrant and often tribal world of Australian rules football, few supporter figures ever achieve a level of notoriety that transcends their club. Joffa Corfe was one of those rare exceptions. For decades, he was the heart and soul of the Collingwood Football Club's cheer squad, a passionate and instantly recognisable figurehead for the Magpie Army. His image was synonymous with the black and white stripes, a constant presence in the stands, leading chants and orchestrating the unfurling of the banner. His dedication was legendary, his voice a familiar roar that echoed through stadiums across the country, a testament to a life lived for his beloved club. The most iconic element of his public persona was undoubtedly the gold jacket. This glittering garment, a stark and brilliant contrast to the monochrome of the team's colours, became his trademark. When Joffa donned the gold jacket, it was a signal, a ritual understood by fans and rivals alike. It signified that the game was won, that victory for Collingwood was secure. As the final siren neared, he would proudly display a banner emblazoned with the words, "Game over," a theatrical and often galling flourish for opposition supporters. This tradition made him a celebrated hero to Magpie fans and a pantomime villain to everyone else, cementing his status as a genuine footy celebrity. His fame was not confined to the stands of the Melbourne cricket ground. Joffa became a media personality in his own right, a go-to figure for journalists seeking a quote that captured the raw emotion of the game. He was the embodiment of the working-class, die-hard supporter, a role he played with gusto and authenticity. His face was a fixture on television news reports, in newspaper articles, and on sports talk radio, making him one of the most visible and well-known football fans in Australia. This level of public recognition was unprecedented for someone who never kicked a ball in a professional match, a unique status built entirely on unwavering, passionate support. This visibility offered him a platform that extended far beyond the boundary line. He was more than just a loud man in the crowd. He was a cultural touchstone. For many, he represented the ultimate fan, the personification of loyalty and devotion that is the bedrock of Australian sporting culture. His identity was so deeply intertwined with the Collingwood Football Club that it was impossible to think of one without the other. This carefully cultivated public image, built over years of televised passion and theatrical displays of loyalty, would later stand in stark and disturbing contrast to the dark secrets that were eventually brought into the light. Joffa Corfe's public life was not solely defined by his boisterous support for his football team. He leveraged his considerable public profile to engage in significant philanthropic work, most notably through his association with the Epilepsy Foundation of Victoria. This was a cause deeply personal to him, and he dedicated considerable time and energy to raising both funds and awareness. He became a prominent ambassador for the foundation, using his recognisable face and name to front campaigns and encourage donations. This charitable work added a layer of depth to his public persona, painting him as a man who cared deeply about his community and was willing to use his fame for the greater good. This dimension of his life was seen by many as proof of his good character, a man who was as passionate about helping others as he was about his football club. His efforts were widely publicised, reinforcing the image of a rough around the edges but fundamentally decent and compassionate individual. The work with the Epilepsy Foundation allowed him to step outside the often divisive world of football fandom and be seen as a unifying figure. It suggested a man of substance, someone whose identity was not just about screaming from the stands, but also about making a tangible difference in the lives of those facing serious health challenges, which made his later fall from grace all the more shocking. Further cementing his status as a cultural figure, Corfe's life story was deemed compelling enough to be documented in both a biography and a feature film. The 2009 book, titled Joffa, the Movie, the Man, the Collingwood Dream, offered an intimate look into his life, detailing his tough upbringing and the unwavering passion for Collingwood that became his salvation. This narrative was then brought to the big screen in the documentary Joffa, the Movie, which chronicled his journey and celebrated his status as a superfan. These projects presented a curated and sympathetic portrait, framing him as a quintessential Australian battler who found purpose and community through sport. These portrayals were instrumental in shaping the public's perception of him. They were not just about football, they were about resilience, identity, and the power of belonging. The biography in the film transformed him from a mere fan into a folk hero, a man whose life story was held up as an inspiring tale. He was no longer just the guy in the gold jacket. He was the subject of a narrative that celebrated his character and his journey. This carefully constructed public image, built on a foundation of charity and celebrated in print and on screen, would become a central and highly contentious element in the legal drama that was to follow. The carefully polished public image of Joffa Corfe began to irrevocably fracture in May 2021. On that day, the man known for his boisterous presence at football games was thrust into the headlines for a far more sinister reason. News broke that Joffa Corfe had been arrested by detectives from the Sexual Offences and Child Abuse Investigation Team. He was formally charged with a historical count of child sexual abuse, an allegation that sent shockwaves through the AFL community and the wider public. The celebrated fan, the charity ambassador, was now facing a deeply serious criminal accusation. He was granted bail and was scheduled to appear in court, marking the beginning of a long and public legal process. The charge stemmed from an incident that had occurred many years earlier, back in 2005. The public had known Corfe for his loud cheers and gold jacket, but the allegations painted a picture of a hidden predatory side. The specifics of the case were harrowing, detailing an offence against a child who was only 14 years old at the time. The contrast between his public persona as a beloved, larger-than-life character and the nature of the crime he was accused of was jarring and deeply unsettling for many who had followed his public life. The arrest marked the definitive end of his era as a celebrated public figure and the beginning of his new identity as an accused sex offender. The legal proceedings moved forward, and in November 2022, a significant development occurred. Facing the weight of the evidence against him, Joffa Corfe appeared in court and formally pleaded guilty to one count of the sexual penetration of a child under the age of 16. The plea was an admission of guilt, a confirmation that the disturbing allegations were, in fact, true. By pleading guilty, he avoided a full trial, but he could not avoid the public reckoning that was to come. The news of his guilty plea removed any lingering doubt about his culpability and solidified the grim reality of his actions, leaving his supporters and the public to grapple with the betrayal. The admission of guilt laid bare the stark truth that had been hidden for over a decade and a half. The incident was no longer an allegation, but a confirmed historical fact. The man who had been the subject of a biographical film celebrating his life was now a confessed child sex offender. The legal process would now shift from determining guilt to deciding on an appropriate punishment. The stage was set for a sentencing hearing that would become a flashpoint for public debate about justice, fame, and the accountability of those who hold a prominent place in the public eye, forcing a re-evaluation of his entire legacy. The circumstances leading to the heinous act in 2005 revealed a calculated and manipulative grooming process, one that exploited the technology of the time. The court learned that the interaction between Joffa Corfe and his 14-year-old victim did not begin in person. Instead, it started in the digital realm, a space that offered a veneer of anonymity and distance. Corfe initiated contact with the young boy through email and the popular instant messaging platform of the era, MSN Messenger. This online communication was the crucial first step, allowing him to build a rapport and gain the trust of a vulnerable child long before they ever met face-to-face. This digital grooming was a key element of the offence, demonstrating a level of premeditation. The online conversations were not innocent chats. They were a deliberate method used to bridge the significant age gap and break down the boy's natural inhibitions. Corfe used the relative safety of the keyboard to establish a connection that would have been impossible in the real world. For the young victim, this interaction with a well-known public figure would have been exciting and flattering, making him susceptible to manipulation. The court proceedings highlighted how Corfe leveraged his public status even in these private, digital exchanges to create a false sense of security and friendship. The online communication eventually escalated to a real-world meeting. After establishing this digital relationship, Corfe invited the 14-year-old boy to his home in Coburg, a suburb of Melbourne. It was at this residence that the trust cultivated online was shattered. The interaction transitioned from the virtual world to the physical, and Corfe committed the act of sexual penetration against the child. The sequence of events, from digital messages to the physical offence, painted a clear and disturbing picture of predatory behaviour. The use of MSN Messenger and email was not an incidental detail, it was the very tool that enabled the crime to occur. This aspect of the case serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that have long existed in online spaces, particularly for young and vulnerable individuals. Even in 2005, before the universal dominance of modern social media, platforms like MSN Messenger could be exploited by abusers. The case against Corfe underscored how predators can use technology to methodically groom and isolate their victims, creating a pathway that leads from a seemingly harmless online chat to a devastating real-life crime. The digital prelude was an integral part of the narrative, revealing the calculated nature of the abuse and the profound breach of trust that began with the simple click of a mouse. In February 2023, the legal proceedings against Joffa Corfe reached their conclusion in the County Court of Victoria. After his guilty plea the previous year, the focus of this hearing was on determining his punishment. The prosecution and defence presented their cases, and the court considered various factors, including Corfe's plea, his public profile, and the impact of his crime on the victim. The community waited, expecting a sentence that would reflect the gravity of sexually abusing a 14-year-old child. The outcome, however, would prove to be one of the most contentious aspects of the entire saga, sparking widespread debate and anger. The judge delivered the sentence, a 12-month term of imprisonment. However, in a decision that stunned many observers, the entire sentence was wholly suspended for a period of 2 years. This meant that Joffa Corfe would not spend a single day in jail for his crime, provided he did not commit another offence during the suspension period. He was permitted to walk free from court. The reasoning for this leniency included his guilty plea, which spared the victim the trauma of a trial, his prior good character, and his prospects for rehabilitation. The court determined that immediate incarceration was not necessary in this specific instance. This decision was honestly a legal bombshell. A wholly suspended sentence for a crime of this nature is exceptionally rare and often reserved for cases with highly unusual mitigating circumstances. To the public, the message it sent was deeply troubling. It appeared to diminish the severity of child sexual abuse and suggested that a confession and a previously positive public image could be enough to avoid any tangible punishment. The legal complexities behind the decision were lost on many, who saw only a simple, infuriating fact. A confessed child sex offender had been allowed to walk free without serving any time in prison. The suspended sentence immediately became the focal point of intense public and media scrutiny. Legal experts, victims' advocates, and the general public questioned the appropriateness of the punishment. The decision raised profound questions about the consistency and fairness of the justice system. How could a crime with such a devastating and lasting impact on a young victim result in a sentence that involved no actual imprisonment? The ruling transformed the Joffa Corfe case from a story about the fall of a public figure into a national conversation about whether the legal system truly holds powerful or famous individuals to the same standard of accountability as everyone else. During the sentencing hearing, the court was given a powerful and heart-wrenching account of the true cost of Joffa Corfe's crime. The victim, now a grown man, bravely chose to confront his abuser directly by reading his victim impact statement aloud in the courtroom. This act of immense courage provided a raw and unfiltered perspective on the long-term devastation caused by the abuse he suffered as a 14-year-old boy. He spoke not just to the judge, but to Corfe himself, detailing the profound psychological harm that had shadowed him for nearly 2 decades, ensuring his voice was central to the proceedings. In his statement, the victim described a life profoundly altered by the events of 2005. He spoke of the deep shame and depression that had plagued him throughout his adolescence and into his adult years. The abuse had stolen his innocence and replaced it with a heavy burden of secrecy and self-blame, feelings common among survivors of such trauma. He articulated the struggle of carrying this secret, the fear of judgment, and the difficulty of forming healthy relationships. His words painted a vivid picture of the invisible wounds that linger long after physical acts are over, a testament to the enduring nature of psychological trauma. The impact on his life was not merely emotional, it was all-encompassing. The victim explained how the abuse had affected his sense of self-worth, his ability to trust others, and his overall mental health. The courage it took for him to finally come forward to the police and then to stand in a courtroom to face the man who had harmed him was immense. His statement served as a powerful counter-narrative to the public image of Joffa Corfe, stripping away the layers of celebrity and charity to reveal the painful reality of his predatory actions. It was a stark reminder that behind the legal arguments and public debate was a human being whose life had been irrevocably damaged. The victim's testimony was a crucial element of the case, forcing everyone present, including Corfe, to confront the human consequences of the crime. It highlighted the immense challenge victims face in seeking justice, a process that often requires them to relive their most traumatic experiences in a public forum. Despite the controversial outcome of the sentencing, the victim's bravery in speaking out was a powerful act of reclamation. By giving voice to his pain, he refused to remain a silent statistic, instead standing as a powerful symbol of resilience and a demand for accountability, ensuring the true impact of the crime was heard and recorded. The announcement of Joffa Corfe's wholly suspended sentence triggered an immediate and furious public backlash. Across social media, news forums and talkback radio, there was a palpable sense of disbelief and outrage. The consensus among many was that the punishment simply did not fit the crime. For a figure who had pleaded guilty to the sexual penetration of a 14-year-old, a sentence that involved no jail time felt like a gross miscarriage of justice. The public's anger was not just directed at Corfe, but at the legal system itself, which many felt had failed to deliver a just outcome for the victim and the community. Much of the criticism centered on the perception that Corfe's celebrity status had played a decisive role in the lenient sentence. Many people believed that an ordinary citizen, without the public profile and connections of Joffa Corfe, would have undoubtedly faced imprisonment for the same offence. This sentiment fueled a broader conversation about a perceived two-tiered justice system, one for the rich and famous, and another for everyone else. The case became a lightning rod for frustrations about inequality before the law, with Corfe's freedom seen as stark evidence that fame and public image could shield an individual from the full consequences of their actions. The media amplified this public outcry, with headlines and editorials questioning the judge's decision. Legal commentators were called upon to explain how such a sentence could be possible, but for many, the legal justifications offered little comfort. Victims' advocacy groups were particularly vocal in their condemnation, warning that such a light sentence could deter other survivors of historical abuse from coming forward. They argued that it sent a dangerous message that society does not take child sexual abuse seriously enough, and that perpetrators might not be held fully accountable, undermining the courage it takes for victims to seek justice. The controversy grew so intense that it placed significant pressure on the Director of Public Prosecutions, Kerry Judd, to appeal the sentence on the grounds of it being manifestly inadequate. The public campaign for an appeal was loud and sustained, with many hoping that a higher court would intervene and impose a term of actual imprisonment. However, after a review, The DPP announced that she would not be appealing the decision, stating that the prospects of a successful appeal were not strong enough. This final decision solidified the outcome, leaving many with a lingering sense of injustice and a deep-seated concern about the fairness of the legal process in high-profile cases. A particularly controversial aspect of the sentencing hearing was the use of character references submitted on Jeffrey Corfe's behalf. These references, provided by individuals who knew him, were intended to paint a picture of his otherwise good character, highlighting his charity work and community contributions. In legal proceedings, such testimonials are often used to argue for a more lenient sentence. However, in Corfe's case, the nature and validity of these references came under intense scrutiny, adding another layer of controversy to the proceedings and raising serious questions about their role in the justice system, especially when a public figure is involved. The controversy deepened when it was revealed that at least one of the character references may have been submitted improperly. Jeremy Maxwell, a former fundraising manager for the Epilepsy Foundation, expressed his shock and dismay upon learning that a reference he had provided for a different purpose years earlier had been used in court without his knowledge or consent. This revelation was deeply concerning, suggesting a potential manipulation of the court process. The involvement of another prominent figure, the late Father Bob Maguire, was also noted as being unclear, casting further doubt on the integrity of the evidence presented in Corfe's favour during the sentencing. These issues prompted a swift response from victims' advocates, including the Victims of Crime Commissioner, Fiona McCormack. She called for government action to reform the way character references are handled in court, arguing for stricter verification processes to ensure their authenticity and relevance. The situation highlighted a potential loophole in the system, where outdated or unauthorized testimonials could be used to influence a judicial outcome. The controversy suggested that Corfe's defense may have leveraged his public connections in a way that was, at best, ethically questionable, and at worst, an abuse of the legal process to secure a more favorable sentence. Ultimately, the character reference saga reinforced the public's suspicion that Corfe's fame had unduly influenced the legal outcome. It appeared as though the carefully constructed public persona of Joffa, the charity man and community icon, was being weaponized in court to overshadow the gravity of his crime against a child. This tactic, whether intentional or not, worked to center the narrative on the perpetrator's potential for redemption, rather than the irreparable harm done to the victim. The episode served as a stark illustration of how celebrity and public status can distort the scales of justice, leaving a bitter sense that accountability had been compromised. The story of Joffa Corfe serves as a deeply unsettling cautionary tale about the complex and often troubling intersection of celebrity, accountability, and justice. His journey from a celebrated football icon to a convicted child sex offender forces a difficult societal reckoning. For years, his public identity was built on passion, loyalty, and community spirit, qualities that were celebrated in media, a biography, and even a film. This curated image created a powerful narrative of a flawed but ultimately good man, a narrative that made the revelation of his dark secret all the more jarring, and his subsequent lenient sentence all the more infuriating for many. The case casts a harsh light on how public status can warp perceptions of guilt and influence legal outcomes. The widespread public outcry following his wholly suspended sentence was not just about one man. It was a response to the deeply held suspicion that fame provides a shield against true accountability. The use of character references, the emphasis on his charity work, and the final decision to spare him jail time all contributed to a perception that the justice system had been swayed by his public profile. It begs the question, does a person's public good deeds mitigate the severity of their private evils, especially when those evils involve the abuse of a child? Furthermore, the Corfe case powerfully illustrates the immense barriers that victims of abuse, particularly historical abuse, must overcome. The victim in this case carried the burden of shame and trauma for over 15 years before seeing his abuser face a court. His courage in coming forward and in speaking his truth during the hearing stands in stark contrast to the secrecy and shame that so often silence survivors. The light sentence, however, threatens to reinforce that silence, potentially discouraging other victims from believing that the arduous and re-traumatizing process of seeking justice will lead to a meaningful outcome. Ultimately, the fractured legacy of Joffa Corfe is not just about the fall of one man. It is a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about our society, our willingness to create and celebrate heroes, our struggle to reconcile their public personas with their private sins, and the persistent flaws in a justice system that can appear to value reputation over the protection of the vulnerable. The story is a potent reminder that true justice demands that we listen to and believe victims, and that accountability must be absolute, regardless of how famous, beloved, or charitable a perpetrator may appear to be. The gold jacket is gone, and what remains is a tarnished legacy that demands our continued scrutiny.